Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by the goldsilverbitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Matt Ehret. Matt Ehret is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He is author of The Untold History of Canada book series and Clash of the Two Americas. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I wanted to dive in with what I think is at the top of most people's heads who are thinking about these geopolitical types of topics currently, and that is Russia and Ukraine, the Ukraine war as it's currently called in the West. Now, could you kind of give us a review of the events as you see them and what you expect moving forward?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the key topics that gets sort of thrown about and I think abused a little bit as far as Orwellian newspeak is concerned is this idea that we are witnessing currently a repeat of World War II, and that Russia is playing the role of Hitler, taking over control of the new Czechoslovakia and Poland, which is Ukraine, as a precedent for a broader attempted takeover of a Fourth Reich around the world, a Russian-speaking Reich, to fulfill Putin's malevolent ambitions. And it's really a wild stretch of the imagination that certain people, seemingly educated people, believe this. But when you actually look at the facts as they have unfolded, not just for the past few weeks or even since 2014, when there was a coup d'etat and a certain puppet regime was installed in Ukraine, but even going further back, all the way to World War II itself, to 1945, I think it becomes increasingly clear that Putin represents a sort of orientation amongst certain leaders within the world community, especially in Eurasia, who do not wish to sacrifice their ancient civilizations on the altar of a great reset of the system. And in fact, he is actually trying to win World War II, which was never something resolved. And that's been an elephant in the room for many people, that those who financed Hitler, people often, were given a lot of war movies and a lot of, pat on the backs for having put down the Nazi machine during the 1940s. The reality is, when you look at what was above Hitler, what were the financial money bags pouring cash into the Nazi coffers, directing, even providing geopolitical strategy throughout the 1920s and 30s into Germany and into fascist Italy, as far as what they would do to be enforcers of a new world order. Those financiers in Wall Street, in London, the JP Morgan crowd, the Brown Brothers Harriman banking crowd with that George Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, made the Bush family fortune by funding Hitler, working with other major industrialists, supplying most of the rubber, the petroleum, the Rockefeller interests, providing the oil and gas to the Hitler machine while World War II was happening. This is something these groups were never punished in Nuremberg. A few lower level Nazis were hung, of course, for public propaganda purposes, but the actual machine itself that made it happen was never done away with. There was no evidence that they stopped with their fascist ambitions for world control, world government. And in fact, many of the players, the people who, like Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's primary intelligence agent, or the person who ran the intelligence apparatus of Nazi Germany, was absorbed by Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, for many years. He was the guy who was fired by Kennedy, and then ran the Warren Commission, that was supposedly the thing that proved definitely that a lone gunman killed the president who fired him earlier. But Allen Dulles absorbed Gehlen and his entire network to not just run the West German intelligence agencies after World War II, after 1955 especially, but all of Eastern Europe was staffed and controlled by the Nazi Gehlen intelligence network the entire time. And the idea was the Cold War was sort of the new battle plan after 1945, and everything was justified to stop communism, including working with a lot of Nazis. And this went into also remobilizing the Ukrainian Nazis, people like Mykola Lebed, who ran the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Stefan Bandera, who was brought into the Gehlen networks by Allen Dulles to perform terrorist activities, assassinations, other things, not just against socialist movements, but also against the general population of Europe, as a way to keep them in a state of terror throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s. This is some people have come to know that of this, or one aspect of this is Operation Gladio, that touched all of Europe, such that these governments that were increasingly brought under the control of the financiers were given more power to maintain order. You know, if the people were scared, they give off their freedoms to a stabilizing sort of security force. This was the strategy throughout the entirety of the Cold War. The Nazi apparatus not only was not punished in, I mean, what I'm talking about is the Nazi apparatus of Ukraine was certainly not punished. They were forgiven for all their sins, even though hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles and Gypsies and other dirty Slavic subhumans, Untermenschen, were killed, assassinated, burnt, tortured to death throughout World War II. And this is what was activated. This second, third generation force was activated in the form of the Azov Battalion, the Pravi Sector, and other groups that have been carrying out atrocities after the Victoria Nuland steered regime change in Ukraine back in 2014 in February that overturned a pro-Russian Yanukovych government, which was moving away from integration into the dying EU and into a more cooperative strategy with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. So it was these Azovs, these Nazi swastika carrying officials or paramilitary groups who did a lot of the dirtiest work and have been continuously carrying out genocide, kidnappings, murders, all sorts of things for 8 years against the East Donbass pro-Ukraine, pro-Russian people. I mean, most of Eastern Ukraine is full of people who identify as Russians. It's kind of an artificial country in that sense. And these are people who had voted immediately after the regime change. That again, this is like on public record. Victoria Nuland steered this thing. They voted to have independent publics of Lugansk and Donetsk, and they'd been for 8 years. They were waiting for it. They suffered 15,000 people. Many of them were civilians in the thousands who died by these Azov strikes illegally on their country. And finally, Russia recognized them on February 22nd as independent countries. This was their sovereign request. They had votes for 8 years. They had plebiscites with over 90% turnout voting in favor of declaring themselves independent of Kiev. So that was recognized. They requested Russia intervene. They signed a treaty of a cooperative security treaty with Russia. And this was done specifically at that time because there was evidence that came to the surface, very strong evidence, that there was a planned attack by these Azovs and paramilitary groups against Crimea and East Donbass that was going to carry out a mass atrocity. So rather than watching millions of their people die, the Russians decided now to stay in control of the situation and go in and take out these different renegade groups. Again, full of, the Nazi thing is a big deal. It's really big culturally. It's there actively. And now there's the additional factor as well that people are hearing more and more about, of biolabs as well, that can produce very malevolent, weaponized pathogens. There's a lot of evidence for that Russia has taken control of, that were all run by the US Defense Department in Ukraine, on the eastern side especially. So there's all of these like layers to this thing. But I would say that Putin was really trying to win World War II. To make it simple, that's really what he's trying to do, is win World War II.
Yeah, lots to unpack there. I would say that one of the critiques of especially the Nazification of Ukraine is that Zelensky, I believe, is not your typical Aryan. So I'm curious what you might respond to that. Then furthermore, however, I want to kind of dig into how you view Zelensky.
Yeah, there was a little video of him as a performer. He's an actor, comedian. And there's a video that I had watched, a disturbing one, of him in high heels, leather-bound high heels, and sort of like a dominatrix gear, with his belly showing, and 4 other guys lip syncing some heavy metal thing and dry humping each other for about 5 or 6 minutes on TV, on Ukrainian TV. It's disturbing. They're really into it, even though it's comedy, so-called, if you want to call it that. But he's a monkey. I mean, the guy is a performer. His life and career has been controlled by very powerful oligarchical interests of Ukraine that were created especially during the perestroika era time of the 1990s. There's one particular figure who plays a very important role in both the funding of the Azovs, the rise of the Nazi paramilitary groups, as well as Zelensky's career, which is Igor Kolomoisky. And this billionaire is one of the richest people in Ukraine. He runs most of the media channels, all of the media stations that Zelensky has worked under. His entire career has been owned by this Kolomoisky fellow. And Ihor is also the major financier. He worked closely with Victoria Nuland. She provided a lot of the logistical support and guidance with Andrei Perubi, who is the head of the right sector and a major organizer of Azovs. He provided the money bags to all of these things. And this is openly known. Even mainstream press for the past 7 years have openly talked about this. So this is wide out there, well known. He's also a figure who's a major owner of Burisma Holdings through several holding companies in the Virgin Islands. So he owns several companies, two of which were created in 2011, and they're the primary shareholders of Burisma. And I think at this point, everybody listening knows what Burisma is, as the biggest natural gas and oil company of Ukraine, which has been used as graft by Joe Biden, who was visiting Ukraine every 3 months while vice president under Obama, and installed his own son Hunter, the disaster wannabe porn star crackhead pedophile, apparently, is what I've heard increasingly, and it seems like there's evidence to back that up based on the fact that his hard drives are not fake, but have been even validated by the Washington, I think it's the Washington Journal or the New York Times. Validated this as being actually, oh yeah, they were right this whole time. These were actually truly his hard drives. This was not Russian propaganda. So he was installed receiving $50,000 a month for something he was completely unqualified to do, and at least $3 million in bonuses for basically opening up access to his father Joe and many other high-level power players inside of the United States who reaped massive financial benefits. So the fact that, again, here you have an intersection, right, where Kolomoisky has been funding Azovs. He's been controlling the career and world of Zelensky, the puppet. He's been a major financier and backer and owner of Burisma, bringing him very much into the inner echelons around the Joe and Hunter Biden networks. This also brings us into the control and the funding of the biolabs, since it's also been revealed just this week by looking at some of the content of the emails within the Hunter Biden laptop that Hunter was one of the biggest financial backers of Metabiota through a company that he had co-controlled. I forgot the name of it. I have it written down somewhere. Anyway, but Hunter Biden was actually one of the major investors with Metabiota, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, private contractor working for the U.S. military industrial complex, and specifically the biolab infrastructure that's been such a focus in people's attention. So that's how you get somebody like Zelensky, who's nominally a Jew, to work with Nazis, or to at least create a situation where the Nazis continue to have immense amount of influence in the intelligence services, the SBU of Ukraine, which is really under the complete control of the CIA and has been since 2014. And he has no real control or influence directly over these paramilitary groups. They say that they're integrated into the U.S. into the Ukrainian official defense forces. That's not true. They really are an independently operational process.
I suppose I would have to suggest that perhaps Western intelligence agencies, the CIA, which came out of the OSS in the wake of World War II, have probably been very active in all of Europe, and perhaps particularly in the east of Europe, ever since the end of World War II. And so 2014 has certainly become a flashpoint. Yeah. Certainly I guess it was a kind of perhaps in the tradition of the Pinochets of kind of Latin America and the intelligence agencies being active in those sort of overthrows. Yeah. Of course, the CIA involvement in the dirty war, and really all over the world. And I think that what we're seeing here is not so much the result of what happened in 2014, but the result of a much longer, decades-long trends of perhaps intelligence, either alliances or just clandestine operations in the east of Europe in particular. I'm going to start pushing back though. So I hear everything you've said, and just for the spirit of perhaps the audience and maybe trying to bring people of different perspectives together. I want to push back on the view that you presented and the facts that you presented. So,
Sure.
for instance, let's say intelligence agencies are suggesting that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, that he's a communist. Now, that's fair, despite utterances by Putin that he's not, and that it's essentially a dead end alley of civilization that is communism. He has recognized these people's republics, which sort of hints back to or harkens back to uh, the Soviet Union. I've heard critiques, though, and ones that I think are easily disputed, about how, for instance, some of these tanks have had the Soviet flag hanging from them. Now, my argument is that, as far as we know, that was the decision of an individual soldier. But nonetheless, we do have the People's Republics being instituted there. So, any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you said, individuals being individuals will do what individuals do. They have the right to, have a Soviet flag if they want to. But I would be hard pressed to find anybody in a position of Russian leadership who has spoken out so critically against Bolshevism and communism more generally than Vladimir Putin. He's conducted the most devastating attacks, describing how the very Bolshevik Revolution itself that gave birth to Soviet Russia. He's even gone further than I would go in criticizing this as an atrocity and a foreign manipulated operation that's destroyed Russian heritage in 1917, 18, 19. He described also the growth of critical race theory. I mean, he's the only world leader that I've heard who's actually called out the creation of the Frankfurt School, critical race theory, the whole, cultural warfare that's turned our culture inside out over the past few decades. That this arose out of the Bolshevik desire of at least a faction of the Bolsheviks around people like George Lukács and Trotsky and others, who wanted to just basically burn the world, to turn culture inside out and recreate society from scratch, kind of like a cultural great reset. And so, I mean, Putin himself is a liberal leaning individual in the sense that he is very much pro-market. You could just see like the activities over the past 20 or so years of his leadership there. Well, yes, he has utilized state power to fight against a lot of these sociopathic oligarchs who were created by London and Wall Street in the 1990s. Some of the worst virulent elements were told, in 2001, 2002, you have a choice. You could either play by the new rules of the game and stop dismantling Russia as you did in the 90s, which was a rape of Russia. It was a field day. Or you can go to jail, or if you want to avoid jail, many of them found ways of getting sanctuary and safer haven, like London or Florida, especially the Moscow on the Thames, where there's a Russian billionaires, oligarchs, mansion section of London, where they've avoided jail. But at the same time, they've got their yachts, they got their mansions, but they're also often more useful dead than alive, as people like Skripal. Skripal's been allowed to stay alive, but he's gone through hell under Novichok poisoning or whatever that came out of. I think when people look at the evidence, this was a British Porton Down biolab operation. This was not the Russians trying to kill Skripal. They would have found other ways of doing that if they really wanted to. But there's been many similar traitors in London who have been just flushed, and the blame has been put. Usually you'll find Christopher Steele's fingers all over it, by the way. Whenever you find one of these characters who get flushed, Christopher Steele, who was formerly the MI6 bureau chief in Moscow, has been in charge of handling every individual case, and blaming always Russia as the big baddie to justify more sanctions, more carving up of East-West relations. But no, so Putin himself, there are certain ethno-nationalists who have romantic ideas of the old Soviet Union in Russia. I could tell you by looking at the composite of the power players right now in the Russian government, especially in Putin's party, they're nowhere near anything of power. It's not a factor in geopolitical affairs, and Putin is definitely not one of those. He does, however, want to save Russia. He does see that Russia has been targeted for total destruction, especially since 1992. And he is absolutely committed to saving it, just like he has colleagues in India, in China, who are committed to saving their countries, which are also targeted for division, destruction, dismantling under a one world government. So there's a certain coalition of people that don't want to see their civilizations annihilated at this point, who are working together.
Putin acknowledged the psychological aspects of such operations. They fall in line with Pentagon policies such as full spectrum dominance, for instance.
Yeah.
He says that they're imposing, Putin does, ideologies on their own societies and exporting these ideologies to Russia and going against certain Christian values. Now, I hesitate to herald Vladimir Putin as a model Christian by any means.
Sure.
I'm open-minded to perhaps this is more a form of fascism that's forming there in Russia with kind of a Christian veneer. However, again, like I stated, I've watched 2 hours worth of Putin speeches and I found them historical for sure and important. Now, I do want to continue pushing back on this and kind of give perhaps the Western view of some of the more intellectuals,
Sure.
Like for instance, portraying Putin as a killer. For instance, I guess I've heard some people state. Now, you could trace this back to his time working in East Germany for, I suppose, overseeing Stasi operations as a KGB officer. Although I'm not too clear on, I imagine East Germany of the Soviet republics had greater autonomy than others, but nonetheless, you see that there's a new book by Catherine Belton exploring charges that Dresden KGB case officer Putin provided support for Baader-Meinhof terrorists in DDR during 1980s. There's new interest in suspicious apartment bombings in Moscow and other cities in September 1999. I believe these were the, Russian apartment bombings, I believe they're referred to. Perhaps just the Moscow apartment bombings, something along those lines. These bombings triggered the Second Chechen War and set the stage for Putin's presidency. So what are we to make of Putin's time in the KGB and, for the purposes of this question, I suppose, in East Germany?
Well, I think there's a lot of misinformation. I mean, the intelligence goons and misinfo warriors who love, I mean, you could spin information and just pick and choose which information backs up your pre-decided thesis and ignore information that contradicts your thesis. And it's done all the time, right? That's the way. I mean, I don't want to get this video censored, so I won't give examples that could come to my mind of how statistics and data are manipulated to give a predetermined outcome, even though reality demonstrates otherwise. I think when you look at the Baader-Meinhof gang and a lot of these terrorist cells that carried out certain terrorist activity throughout the 1970s, especially, and into the 80s, the actual evidence that I have seen, and I think that anybody who looks honestly at the data, books have been written about this too, link this more to the Operation Gladio that was run by the CIA and NATO, as I touched upon it at the beginning of our discussion, which was set up in 1956, utilizing Nazi stay-behinds and fascist Italian stay-behinds that created cells and cells within cells of terrorist groups, all tied to Western intelligence networks. And a lot of these carried out the murders of leaders like Alfred Herrhausen, for example, was one such leader, the president of Deutsche Bank in 1989, who was assassinated by one of these Red Brigade bombings that cut his limo in half and killed him. But he was a visionary who had a really bold view of utilizing the end of the Soviet Union as a springboard for a global reindustrial program of giving full spectrum economies, or creating full spectrum economies that could stand on their own 2 feet all over the former Soviet states, as well as Russia itself. It was a very different way of thinking about banking, which created a lot of enemies from those who were within the actual inner sanctum, who wanted to use this as an excuse to just create a one world government, a unipolar era, you know? So the Baader-Meinhof gang is a part of this it's more closely aligned with the Western controlled Nazi and fascist stay-behinds than it is with anything that Russia was actually doing, though people try to put the blame for all sorts of things on Russia during the Cold War. As far as the apartment bombings, I've seen arguments and again, explanatory models that have tried to put the blame on like this being an inside job. I haven't seen it. There's a lot of leaps in assumptions that are made in the course of that ignore a lot of operations of Western intelligence as if they don't even exist. So I'll just say that's sort of like a whole discussion unto itself. I have not been persuaded by the evidence I have seen that that was an inside job by Putin. What I have seen, though, is that NATO was at that time getting ready for a new aggressive expansion. They had just done a bombing campaign of Yugoslavia, of Belgrade, for 80 days that have killed over 50,000 civilians. This was a NATO illegal bombing campaign. There was the growth of Western Islamic terrorism. This was something that was grown directly out of the bowels of Operation Cyclone, which Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was national security advisor under Carter, had spearheaded, which was designed in the early 80s to, fund radical Wahhabi groups or sects, madrasas in Afghanistan, Pakistan, some other places to try to absorb the Soviets into an unwinnable, their own Vietnam War that they could not extract themselves out of, which was sort of something that Zbigniew applauded himself as having been the greatest maneuver of his professional life, despite the fact that it created ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, ISIS grew out of this and were continuously used by Western intelligence. There's been discoveries that the CIA, MI6 has been behind the funding, the logistical support of these groups to overthrow Gaddafi, that ran operations against Syria, that continue to, and that were even brought into Ukraine. There were 450 at least jihadis who were brought in via Turkey from Syria a few weeks ago into Ukraine to fight alongside their their comrades on the Eastern Front. So I mean, this is all ignored. Whenever I've seen those sorts of arguments you've just pointed out, especially in regards to the 1999 bombing of the buildings, it's just all of this other context is just ignored when they try to just spin the facts to make it seem all like, inside job by Putin. I just didn't see that. I'm not convinced.
I think anybody who's saying, you mentioned the bombing campaign in Bosnia, was that to perhaps institute a no-fly zone?
That was part of it, but it was more than that. I don't know the full details of like the motive behind it necessarily. It did create a precedent though for this idea of a new security doctrine called responsibility to protect, R2P, which was sort of the first time that the R2P doctrine went into practice, which was the idea that we no longer need to respect the sovereignty of nation states, which was enshrined in the United Nations Charter of, in Article 1 and Articles 2 of the UN Charter. No aggressive war by one power against another was legal. You couldn't do it by international law, and it had been reinforced by many treaties over the years. So this R2P idea was that no, that's obsolete, because in the age of terrorism, the age of dictators, sometimes a coalition of nations must use their power militarily to stop a genocide from happening and conduct a bombing campaign, a humanitarian bombing campaign, which is also, we saw the use of that in shock and awe and the Saddam Hussein bombing of against Iraq in 2003. Or Libya, the destruction of Libya. So that was, I think, the first example of it ever being used, and that created, in some people's minds, a legal precedent for the continuation of this into the post 9/11 age.
The Iraq bombings, and I was asking about the Bosnia ones, were to a precursor to the no-fly zone. I believe they went on for 6 weeks. Now, those calling for no-fly zones either do or don't understand that one thing would happen before that. Ukraine would be bombed back to the Stone Age. Perhaps to the Ural Mountains would be bombed strategically as well to institute that no-fly zone, as well as into Belarus. Now, Zelensky is calling to prevent World War III, that we institute a no-fly zone or otherwise start World War III.
Yeah.
Zelensky, I'm following Webster Tarpley. Are you familiar with Webster Tarpley? Have you followed?
I love his old. I've read all of his old stuff before, like 2015. I really liked almost everything he did before.
Okay, I've been listening to him lately, once a week, about his analysis. So that's where I'm kind of getting some of these ideas. It is interesting and to listen to the way he's viewing the world and seeing these events now. So, for instance, not even he likes Zelensky, the kind of cult of personality that's formed around him. Underplays, for instance, his big mistakes, as Tarpley points out, not warning the population beforehand, saying that nothing was going to happen, that the intel out of Washington was fake news, essentially. If they had such intel, I think it would have been more sound to warn the people that this is coming. Instead, he kept them in the dark, and many people did not expect that to happen. Few people. So, in other words, this cold personality around Zelensky is unfounded. I started this off talking about his no-fly zone comments to prevent World War III. Any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. As I mentioned, um, there has been a lot of evidence which has come to light that there was a planned attack that was prepared against the people of Crimea, as well as the people of East Donbass, before Russia decided to take that moment to then intervene. The idea that this was guaranteed to happen, like Russia, people are like, oh, they planned this out for so long. They've always wanted to intervene and take over Ukraine. No, because Russia tried very hard since November, especially of last year, or December of last year, to really get across this agreement for a red line that that all Ukraine had to do was simply agree to abide by the Minsk II agreements, which they had been completely ignoring for the past 8 years, which involved recognizing, giving certain autonomous provincial status to the oblasts of the Luhansk and Donetsk, just simply grant them the sort of status that was once enjoyed by Crimea and keep them part of Ukraine, agree not to join NATO, and don't put missiles into Ukraine's border, which is only 300 miles away from Moscow. Just agree to those things. That's all. They refused to do that. And then Zelensky went even further. So it's not that he didn't tell the West that they had intelligence. He went further and went to the Munich Security Conference in February 19th. And he basically said that unless Ukraine is immediately granted entry into NATO, that we are going to recapture our right to have nuclear warheads, which was something that had been taken down since the early 90s. So that was a big red line. The fact is, it seems like there is evidence that I've seen that has come to light that Ukraine has had a nuclear weapons program, at least to create small mini nukes or little mini dirty bombs that involve utilizing nuclear waste from Chernobyl and other plants, that has been kept secret. But this is something which is there's more evidence coming to light that this has been ongoing, which is intolerable for Russia, to have a country which has the problems Ukraine has as a puppet state of the West, to have control also now, not only of biolaboratories that are conducting weaponized pathogens, but also these sorts of dirty bombs and maybe even nuclear bombs. That was a complete red line. So Zelensky was saber rattling like crazy, sort of like the same thing we see Shinzo Abe doing today. Shinzo Abe, whose grandfather in Japan was a Japanese fascist who conducted war crimes against the Chinese. Shinzo Abe has also come out saying just like 2 weeks ago that Japan needs to change its constitution so that it can acquire nuclear weapons, and has done that in the same speech that he called for the US military to go in openly defending Taiwan against Chinese aggression. And this is it's a very similar game plan being played out in the Pacific as we see now under Russia's soft underbelly, and the same sort of geopolitical, what's called full spectrum dominance, encircling China with US controlled missile systems as a shield, as we see around Russia's perimeter too, in Poland, many other former Soviet bloc countries that have now missiles controlled by the US installed pointed at Russia's territory. I mean, I just seen so much that it points that I think that Webster's analysis of what Zelensky should have done is a little bit simplistic and ignores a lot of rich context of what's really going on.
Any other elaboration on that?
Yeah.
I
As far as I could tell, Webster really thinks that Putin's on the wrong side of history in this whole thing. He's like ravenously against everything Putin has been doing, and he's been pretty supportive of what Biden has been doing for the most part too, which I find weird, considering what Webster should know. Looking at the research that Webster has produced over the past 50 years, And I mean, I've gone back to the 70s. I've read his stuff on Venice, from the old campaigner magazines, the old EIRs. He just knows too much. He knows too much to have the opinions that he does, and actually hold to them honestly. Either he's just deconstructed himself to shape those views that are totally disconnected from what he knows to be shaping world history and politics, or he's lying. And I don't know what it is. I'm not too sure. I just think he should know better.
He fears that the populism we saw with Trump could lead to some sort of fascist dictatorship in the US. He truly does fear that, that's for sure. And he also connects, and I want to kind of move on from his arguments, but he does mention Ivan Ilyan recently in recent podcasts. Are you familiar with Ilyan?
No, educate me. Oh wait, is he a theoretician that has influence around Putin?
No, so he tartly argues that he's a philosopher or a thinker who Putin looks up to, and he's somebody that Tarpley paints as once a supporter or sympathizer of Nazism, and also somebody who advocated for a kind of Christian fascism, that is fascism with a Christian veneer.
Oh yeah, that guy.
He also argues, Tarpley does, that Ilyan also saw Ukraine, independent Ukraine, as an existential threat to Russia. Now, my point in all that is Tarpley's arguing that Ilyan has had a oversized influence on Putin's thinking. Take us inside the mind of Putin.
Well, that's a big question. What I could say is that I do know who you're talking about. First of all, just as words of context, I haven't read this guy, because I only make judgments on people when I've read their writings, at least some essential writings. Not to say that I've read everything by every philosopher, but I've read, if I have an opinion about any philosopher, it's because I've read something essential that they've done, and I try to build on my own personal interactivity with their minds. So I can't say that I've done that with Ilya. Don't know. I do know that Putin has, at least in one speech, quoted some statement that Ilya made from one of his texts. Okay, that I've heard seems to be true. Does that mean that Ilya is this giant influence in his entire way of thinking? That's not a proof that that's the case. I've quoted Ayn Rand to make a point, though I don't like Ayn Rand, but so here's what I know. Putin has lost family members in World War II that he carries very deeply in his heart. He's spoken a lot about his brother, about the devastation his family, his cousins, and others had gone through at the hands of the Nazis, where 25 million Russians were killed during World War II. It's a big wound. I know that that's the case. He definitely hates Nazis a lot. He also doesn't think that the Khrushchev agreement to grant Crimea to Ukraine was legit. I don't know why Khrushchev did that even. I mean, Khrushchev does seem to be a bit of a closet Trotskyite as well, a bit of a strange character who, when I look at, there's this whole story within Russia's history that I'm beginning to sort of piece together slowly here with my wife. We've been doing some research, especially on the Fabian Society and Trotskyite networks that had penetrated much of the Russian intelligentsia throughout the 1920s and earlier as well. I mean, this goes back to the 1800s. People like, anyway, I won't go into any details right now, but you've had foreign operations that ran things like the Bolshevik Revolution. Like when you look at the evidence, people like Anthony P. Sutton is a historian who died a long time ago, but he wrote extensively on the Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. There's some good material in there. I disagree with Sutton's overall way of thinking. Like his libertarian, or he's got a certain variant of libertarianism, which prevents him from seeing a difference between, let's say, a JFK type of government versus a Hitler government. It's like any government that uses political power is equally bad because political power is equally tyrannical, regardless of the wisdom or evil of the statesman. So there's that problem. However, he does good research in terms of pulling together data, and he did. In my mind, I saw that data that he put together in his books. It proves that Jacob Schiff, Max and Paul Warburg, who were people who were behind the creation of the Federal Reserve in the USA in 1913, were also the financial money bags behind the Bolshevik anarchist movements and mobs that were weaponizing the poor and abused people, turning them into anti-nation state operations. Kind of like this is the same thing used for color revolutions in our modern day. So that was done with Wall Street as well as City of London funding. Lord Milner was a part of that. And so when you look at what was brought in, these groups wanted Leon Trotsky to be the head honcho. And Trotsky, there's declassified material that has come to the surface, especially in the last 10 years from the FSB archives that demonstrate that Trotsky had been working and negotiating with Hitler, with British fascists around King Edward VIII, with Ukrainian fascists like Bandera, with Japanese fascists as well, to create a pro-fascist Russia in the 1930s, early 30s. And his networks were complex. He had cells within cells embedded within the Russian military, intelligentsia, you name it. And there were several attempts to try to kill Stalin. You know, Stalin and Trotsky had a big falling out, right? Because Trotsky had this view of permanent global revolution, permanent war, permanent revolution. Stalin was of the view that no, let's just get socialism right in one country. Let's not try to like overturn the whole world. And they had this, it was a fight they couldn't resolve. And so Trotsky was expelled when the Stalin group came into power in 1927, but his followers didn't leave. They stayed undercover. And there were a couple of attempts to try to kill Stalin. And people are told that the Moscow trials were all baloney, like fake mock trials that Stalin did to just like kill his enemies. I've now started seeing work by Grover Furr and many other researchers who have like looked at real source material that demonstrate to me that no, that's actually those were real conspiracies. And Khrushchev seems to be somebody who was part of that and successfully stayed under the radar. And it was only when Stalin died in 1954 that you started seeing the true colors coming out with his secret speech, in 1956 to the Soviet Politburo that started the big de-Stalinization campaign. But that also was part and parcel of providing massive independence or giving Crimea to Ukraine, providing more support for extracting or exporting Russian industries into Ukraine so that it would weaken mainland Russia or the main part of Russia and make them less economically viable in one sense. So there seems to have been a larger strategy there. There's also weird things that I'm coming across now, like the fact that Bill Clinton and Strobe Talbot, two Rhodes Scholars in Oxford during the 60s, were deployed to translate, to get Khrushchev's memoirs and his writings out of Russia. That was Bill Clinton's job on the ground in Russia, in the archives, and Strobe Talbot was the main translator from the West of all of Khrushchev's writings into English in the 60s. That's what got Strobe Talbot, who was in charge of, later on, keep in mind, right, perestroika. He was the guy who worked with Bill Clinton, who was in charge of the Russian. He was Victoria Nuland's boss, actually. She was his personal assistant in the 90s when they were overseeing the dismantling of Russia. So you've got this whole Trotskyite or neo-Trotskyite, neo-fascist thing that had been working, collaborating with Nazis, that turned into the neocons. Like all of Trotsky, when Trotsky was killed in 1940, all of his leading associates like James Burnham, Albert Volstetter, who was a leading Rand Corporation guy, they became the founding fathers of the neoconservative movement, sort of taking the effect of the permanent war, permanent revolution ideology and just giving it now a Christian end times, burn the earth, Armageddon, rapture ideology, but with the same ultimate effect. This is what Zbigniew Brzezinski tapped into. A lot of these characters like Paul Nietzsche and others who tried to run the Cold War and did run the Cold War, persuading the world that Russia wants a Soviet superstate, one world government. And these were all the characters who were the biggest defenders of capitalism. You're wondering, like, is that serious? Are you really serious? Or is there actually a mind fuck? Like, sorry, I don't want to get this. I might have just gotten this video a hit on YouTube or something. But is there a mind game going on right now to play people against each other with these false opposites? And that does seem to be what has been occurring. So Putin definitely hates that stuff. I've seen only evidence that, again, he despises these traitors. And he's been trying to refocus the Russian identity around less communism and the revolutionary period. This actually makes him a lot of enemies with people who like Russia, who are Russian, because he attacks the Bolshevism so much. And he's been trying to get the identity to really encircle the idea that we defeated Hitler. It's this, the glorious war. This is the Russian character. We are anti-Nazi by our character. Fighting Hitler was what makes us us. That type of willingness to sacrifice and persevere. Also, he's looking more at the I think the better qualities of Tsar Alexander II and III of the late 1800s, the great liberator who fought for reforming Russia, getting rid of the serfs, or the serf slave system of Russia in 1861, and unleashing credit for industrial development. Though it wasn't successful, it was sabotaged, but that was sort of the type of policy that Putin tends to look back to positively and is trying to sort of revive in a positive way today.
Putin has spoken at World Economic Forum meetings, and I believe in 2017 or perhaps 2019, he gave an interesting speech in which he talked about the decline of traditional values being and posing a threat and deserving of opposition. And he also discussed the declining standard of living amongst particularly those in the developed world. And he gave a rebuke of that and cited data from international organizations and highlighted a need to turn that around.
Yeah.
Now, Klaus Schwab claimed, and I don't have evidence for this, that Putin was a young global leader before I think young global leaders existed. That's a claim that Klaus made, has zero backing. I don't know if that's true. Says they've known each other since 1992.
That's true. That seems to be true.
Can you
they've known each other since 92.
Speak about their relationship.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, yeah, it's gone viral, and there's a lot of truth in what Klaus Schwab said in that speech that went viral, which is like that, half of the Canadian cabinet were all World Economic Forum young leaders. Oh yeah, 100%. Many of the young leaders that have penetrated governments in Europe and South America and Argentina. Oh yeah. But then he dropped that bombshell, right? Like Vladimir Putin was young, a world leader. No, there's actually that was never true. And I think he knew that it wasn't true. And that was a bit of a psyop. And I think what you'll find is that the oligarchy, and Klaus Schwab is not high echelon oligarchy. Okay. He's high echelon upper level management, but he is not himself a decider. His life has been managed from an early age as a prodigy of Henry Kissinger and people like Maurice Strong when he was installed and given an assignment to set up this so-called, dialogue group in Davos in 1971. But he's not his own man, okay? He's sort of like a synthetic cardboard cutout. He's a good Dr. Evil type of personality to give people something to hate or fear who are thinking maybe a bit outside the box. But he's deployable and expendable if need be. He's not a thing unto himself, okay? Now, what they will often do, though, is they try to claim territory. Like, so there's currently, there was a speech by Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, last November, where he gave out a warning. He was petrified, basically saying that if we can't get everybody on the same page as we had been on the same page a decade earlier, if we can't do that, we fear that there's going to be two separate approaches, two different systems of AI, of 3D printing, of the Internet of Things, that are not compatible with each other. We have to get everybody on the same page, though. And so he was imploring that we do something to get everybody on the same bandwagon once more. Of course, he was referring to the breakaway paradigm that we've seen forming, especially since 2013, with Russia, China as the base of the multipolar approach to what the next system is going to be, because there will be a new operating system brought online. The current system was a time bomb. It was set up as a time bomb in 1971 when the dollar was detached from the gold reserve system and turned into a speculative basket case tied to commodities, spot markets and futures markets. We lost our economy back then, and increasingly became a time bomb of speculative fictitious capital that's been growing as a bubble, and bubbles can only pop. That's their nature. As people became more myopic, they thought less about the long-term future, past, and thought only about momentary maximizations of profit, right? In a casino-like mentality. And that became the economy. That was not the economy. The economy is what we allowed to atrophy. Our infrastructure physical productive powers have been permitted to atrophy for 50 plus years. So that was the design, and the intention was to get that effect of crippling our ability to have economic sovereignty, and to create instead a giant bubble as a time bomb that could be plucked or picked by an elite at an appropriate moment to create a controlled demolition. With that chaos, the pain that would ensue would result in a trauma or a shock therapy, which we've seen done in many other parts of the world. In Russia, we saw it done in other parts of South America, right under the IMF shock therapy. You do a total trauma on a people that then has them weakened to accepting of things that they would normally never accept under stable democratic conditions, like massive austerity, things that involved cutting your living standards, cutting your quality of life, and other things, privatizing whatever remains to a small grouping in the insiders club. So we've had now Russia, China, increasingly now Iran, with their $400 billion deal with China, as well as a similar deal with Russia, create a foundation of a new architecture based on a different way of utilizing a lot of those technological tools that are not going away. Like, honestly, like if you think about what things like when Klaus Schwab talks about like the fourth industrial revolution, or you hear any of these Davos great resetters, they're talking about what the internet of things. Like, so, there's a whole variety of things. It's not just the internet. It's, smartphones, communications with, your houses, other things, like the houses that sort of like can respond to your voice commands, a whole variety of things. AI, like machine learning, 3D printing is a big one, which involve doing a lot of the repetitive activities that humans have been forced to do for a long time. Now, the question should be in anybody's mind philosophically is, are these things intrinsically bad things? I would say, just like any tool, these things are neutral by themselves. What imbues them with bad or goodness is the intention of those who want to use them to what end. And if you're a eugenicist committed to depopulation, and you believe in like transhumanism as your religion, I guarantee you all of these things will be used to enslave. They will not be used for good. However, if you have a different type of intention to design a purpose in your system in which things like 3D printing or AI or other things would be utilized, yeah, I could see how these are very positive things that could benefit us by alleviating physical human burdens on doing repetitive activities. Or let's say, if you're going to have a space-driven economy with like mining of asteroids or mining of other, like the moon or Mars, which is seriously what China and Russia are really advancing on. They have a joint program to build a China-US moon research center by 2030, and that's part of the China broader lunar mining operation. That's why they landed on the far side of the moon, where there's a lot of helium-3, but there's a lot of other things, rare earths, other things. So you want to have you don't want to just have a bunch of people going into space. That's kind of dangerous. You would want to have, for a sustained period, mostly automated systems. So applying machine type learning that could be called AI. That's fine. That's fine. That would like be able to like learn from mistakes that it makes when it's like mining or encountering something that wasn't in the program when you originally set the thing into motion. Things like certain types of surgeries. Maybe you could have like certain AI forms of tech that could assist with surgeries of certain types. Of course, that's limited as well, because 99 times out of 100, the surgery might involve these activities, but that 100th time, it might be something else that the machine doesn't know what it's dealing with, and it could hurt the patient. So there's that. Now, Putin has been, back to your question, he was indeed at a Davos summit as early as 1992 at a meeting. Yeah, I mean, the guy's been like an insider. Like the whole idea that he was like a taxi driver or something during the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's I think a bit of a story, a bit of a mythology that was thrown out there. No, I mean, the guy's been high level intelligence. He was brought in and into very high level positions around people like Primakov, who was he's a premier of Russia who really didn't want Russia to be destroyed by Yeltsin. So that was sort of his sponsor. Primakov was a great man, really, really great guy. And he was a savvy operator. He was able to keep his mouth shut and project and make bad people think he was their friend. That's how a lot of these Russian oligarchs like supported him, even though if you look at what he did in 2001, 2002, a lot of these oligarchs who had supported him in 1997, 98, 99, they thought they could trust him. Nah, he put a few of them in jail and a bunch of other ones escaped Russia, right? So it just proved to me that he's just a wise operator. I've seen a few examples of statesmen throughout history who have been able to do that. Benjamin Franklin was one example in the United States as somebody who was trained in intelligence at a young age, was able to be deployed to infiltrate and provide intelligence into the Hellfire Clubs of London by Cotton Mather, his patron. Sort of Cotton Mather was kind of like the Primakov of early American patriot colonies. And that was the guy who trained Ben Franklin and deployed him in. And he got a lot of intel back to the Patriot intelligentsia of America into what it was in the inner echelons of British intelligence that they were planning to do and what they were up to, what their thinking was. That was a high value service. And Ben Franklin, anybody, people try to slander him as being like this hellfire pagan witch or something like that, because he did those things in the 1720s. But look at everything he did in his life. Look at the institutions he created. You would be a fool to think that he was a traitor to America. He created America. Like he was a creative. I mean, I don't think that Putin is on that Ben Franklin level of genius, but just to say that these types of things, that's part of our history. There's a sophistication in real statecraft. So that's how I tend to approach it. And I don't think, maybe for a while they thought that they could control Putin, the Western oligarchs. He even made an appeal to say like, hey, let's join NATO. Like I see NATO is growing and growing and growing. How about we just join it too? And I think he kind of played their bluff. He knew that they were never going to let Russia join because their whole plan has always been what Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote openly in his Grand Chessboard in 1997 with the map of a divided Russia into like 8 little mini federations, right, controlled by the West. He knew that that's always the agenda, but it keeps you on the right side of history. It keeps your enemies off the toes, off their balance. I think that's how I see it.
You have a few more minutes, Matt?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, this is right up my alley. Now, Zbig, Zbig thought Bush made a strategic error going into Iraq. I wonder if he thinks the same about Putin going into Ukraine, but that isn't necessarily what I want to focus in on. Okay, so we've got the singularity. You've got this theoretical break in the singularity because of a break in the oligarchy. This follows the trajectory of history. Systems breaking down because there's disputes amongst royalty, royal families, oligarchical families, or otherwise. Now, so the singularity breaks down because of so it's breaking down. We could have different sets of the singularity, that is IoT, et cetera, artificial intelligence. And we have Putin, who has been stating that that there's been a moral degeneration and ethical degeneration in the West because of the ideologies that he highlighted that he feels are being pushed on Russia, just like they're being pushed on populations of the West. And he fears that these systems that are coming to bear, so like perhaps AIs, would be products of a kind of a degenerate, unethical society and also pose a threat to Russia. What do you think about that?
I think it's all about, like I said, values. Like there's a fight over who's going to control the character of this fourth industrial revolution. I think in some ways, the fourth industrial revolution, as far as it just being an idea of the next phase of application of technology, new paradigm technologies to the global economy, is not a bad thing. And that's why, the fight is over what is going to be the ethical outlook that shapes the system in which these technologies are deployed in. So what's the character of that going to be? And is it going to be based upon things that really do value human life? Or is it going to be things that want to enslave human life to a sociopathic elite? And I think that's where the whole fight over culture and values is so important. I think that's actually primary to everything else. That's why Xi Jinping also came out so heavily, to the point that even like anti-Chinese conservatives have had to see this and they're like, it's pretty good. His whole attack on the effeminization of men in their pop culture, the celebrity cult in China, the addiction to video games that has been now limited down to like, 3 hours a week for kids. This is like the new opium war, because the opium war was never about the drugs or the money associated with the drugs that the British Empire ran. It was always about the spiritual addiction, the destruction of the spirit of the people that would make them more pliable. So that this is really the new spiritual opium war of the 21st century, is the cultural fight, and the fact that both the leadership of China, which again, it's not a democracy, it is a meritocracy, which is different, and they are in alignment with the leadership of Russia over this question of what will be the principles that organize the new system. And I could see clearly based on their actions. That's what I always focus on when I'm like judging a person or a leader, especially, is what is their policy, what is their action, not so much always their words, because sometimes they'll say words that I'm like, oh, that sounded bad, they said new world order, as a word that might trigger me, but if I look at the actions, I can see, oh, your idea of the new world order is different from the one that I hate and loathe, that's controlling my part of the world here. And so they've pulled, what is it, almost 1 billion people out of poverty through the Belt and Road Initiative and larger scale investments into major infrastructure. They've built high-speed rail, like 40,000 kilometers of high-speed high-speed rail in China. They're building 5 different maglev corridors in China, and they're exporting industrial development packages into other countries like Nepal, Africa, all over the place, which involves not just giving them money loaded with debt and usury in order to extract their raw materials. Like that's what we've been doing for 80 years. We've been masters at doing that in the West. Whereas with China, they're actually investing in vital soft and hard infrastructure. They're building in Congo, in Kenya, in especially Ethiopia, industrial corridors with training centers to train new generations of engineers who are African, who are being trained to do it themselves, and that's really a very long-term enlightened way of doing capitalism, which we used to do. Like in the West, we used to have that thinking under John F. Kennedy and JFK's efforts to work with Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah to help them build the biggest dam in Africa. Was called the Volga River Dam, which to the very day, Volta River Dam. Volga is in Russia. Volta River Dam in Ghana, which has to this very day a plaque dedicated to JFK. That was the idea, is that we'll do better business if we can help, not just give our neighbors some fish, but help them fish, and that way they'll have a bigger consumer base. They'll be able to buy our finished products. We'll be able to buy their finished products. We'll have new market baskets. And new inventions and discoveries that create upshifts in the overall economic value of the system. That's the way we used to think. And we lost that, unfortunately, over the dead bodies of many great patriots of the West who were killed in things that were tied to Operation Gladio and the Nazi stay-behinds like Allen Dulles, who ran a lot of that stuff. China's doing it. Russia, if you look at Russia's programs with Africa, helping Africa build nuclear reactors for civilian use, that is a vital necessity if Africa is going to have energy security, and also the intelligence needed to go into next generation science. You got to have a robust nuclear sector, and that's what Russia is helping, Rosatom. So there's all sorts of things like that express a totally different paradigm. Additionally, I would just say one thing too. There is a big crackdown now underway against the fifth column deep state of Russia, which has been advancing faster since the Ukraine intervention occurred. And we've seen Anatoly Chubai, who's just announced that he's jumping ship. One of the biggest traders who ran Perestroika. He's still been protected. He's had a lot of power as the head of Rosnano, and then the head of he's been the Russian appointed representative to the UN for Sustainable Development. He's the guy who brought in the Great Reset starting as early as 2011 into Russia. This guy has just jumped ship and said, I'm leaving. I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm going to Turkey, and so long. So you got now, and that's because he could see that there's a clampdown that's gearing up heavily against these fifth column traders. Putin talked about this clampdown heavily. Glaziev, a leading nationalist who I like immensely. I respect Glaziev's work so much. And I think that this guy, who's the Minister of Eurasian Economic Development for the Eurasian Economic Union, he's been granted new immense powers to head up a new commission to set up a new financial architecture with the Chinese. He's been pushing with a certain reform of the Russian central bank around forcing now the purchasing of Russian oil via only rubles. That's going to go into effect in a couple of days. That's a game changer. That's already, counteracted the Western sanctions against Russia immensely, and they've gained back all their losses from the month of February and beyond in a matter of seconds after announcing that. And they're going for a greater ownership of gold as well. Like Russia's even offering now an increased price. As far last time I checked, it was like $10 more than market value to buy up gold, which is the opposite of what the Western geopoliticians thought that they were going to do. They thought they were going to like sell their gold to buy up what, Western dollars or something. I don't know. Like I don't know what they were thinking, but they're definitely making some smart maneuvers currently.
And that's the news today. As we wrap this up, you've been so kind with your time, that the Russian central bank will restart buying gold from banks and will pay a fixed price. Oh, this is from the 25th of 5,000 rubles, 52 per gram between March 28th and June 30th. The bank said on Friday. So Matt, you have been more than generous with your time. This has been very fascinating. I hope we can continue this conversation soon. We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with Matthew Ehret. He's the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's also author of the Untold History of Canada book series and Clash of the Two Americas. Matt, where can people find your work?
Sure, they can go to CanadianPatriot.org to buy the books. If they want a signed copy of any of the books, the 2 copies of the Clash of the Two Americas or the Untold History, they could just write me a message at info@risingtidefoundation.net. The last thing as well, they could subscribe to my Substack. There's free and paid variants, as well as check out the website risingtidefoundation.net that I co-manage with my wife, Cynthia Chung, who's the president. That's just a lot of educational, cultural work that we put there too. So those are the places.
Thank you so much, Matt, for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Justin.
And thank you. Till next time. And thank you everyone for listening.